All right, we better move on. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's also from our lab, and his name's J Allan. And he's in the second year of a master's research degree with our fish ecology lab at UTS. He's focusing on the habitat associations and the northern range distribution of the weedy sea dragons in our part of the world. The research he'll be presenting today is analysing the factors that influence their habitat selection based on a recently finished field study that's being written for publication. He's provided me with a fun fact. I know many fun facts about Sam, but the one he's let us know about is the fact that he teaches surfing. He's an expert surfer when he's not conducting research. So if you ever come visit, he'll take you for a sea dragon dive and then for a good old surf after that. So with no further ado, Sam, you're on.
Thanks, Dave. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
It's all right, yeah. Thanks
for
the
sharing
lovely
your screen, or are you going to just go for it?
I think I'm going to have Jing play my recorded talk. I'd just like to say thanks very much for organising this, everyone. I've really enjoyed some of the talks so far. This is my first Signathan conference, so it's been really cool to see all the work around the world that's been happening, and hopefully you enjoy my talks. If you wouldn't mind playing the recorded version.
Okay, they are good now.
Hello, my name is J Allan. I am a master's research student at the University of Technology, Sydney, studying the ecology and demography of weedy sea dragons under the supervision of Selma Clempton and David Booth. Today I'll be presenting findings from our recent study that is analysing space use of the endemic weedy sea dragon and looking at the influence of habitat and prey. I'd just briefly like to acknowledge Max O'Connell, who's another research student at UTS, who helped out on this project, and then both my supervisors, Selma and Dave. So I won't go too much into the background of weedy sea dragons, as both Dave Booth and Selma Clinton have already covered that. But just briefly, sea dragons are endemic to the temperate reefs of Southern Australia. So they range from Port Stephens in New South Wales, which is just a couple of hours north of Sydney, over into Geraldton, WA, which is just a little bit north of Perth, and everywhere in between, so down to Tasmania, through the Great Australian Bight in South Australia, and also in Victoria. They're one of only 3 sea dragon species, the leafy sea dragon, weedy sea dragon, ruby sea dragon, all which are endemic to Australia. They were recently listed as least concern by the IUCN Red List, having been reassessed from a near threatened population. However, there's been a study which has showed decreasing population trends in 2011 of weedy sea dragons across a number of different sites by Jaime Sanchez-Camara in 2011. Sea dragons do have a highly understudied ecology as well, with only a handful of papers being studied looking at various aspects of their ecology. So I'll be focusing on both habitat use, preferences, and selection of weedy sea dragons. So in marine fishes, it's known that both habitat availability and prey availability are key drivers of habitat selection. And we expect this to be the case with sea dragons as well. So the kelp sand interface was identified as the most favourable habitat for sea dragons by Sanchez-Camara in 2006. This was suggested because it is where the sea dragons have the best trade-off between camouflage from the habitat and then also prey availability. But this wasn't actually analysed. So mice and shrimp are the main source of food for sea dragons, making up over 80% of their diet. However, no studies so far have analysed factors influencing sea dragon habitat selection or looked at sea dragon habitat preferences. So the aims of this study were firstly to identify the habitat preferences of weedy sea dragons, and then secondly to analyse the influence of kelp habitat, primarily Aclonia, and the presence of mysid shrimp or availability of mysid shrimp on weedy sea dragon habitat selection. So this study was conducted in Cornell, which is in the south of Sydney in New South Wales. The reason this was done at Cornell is because there's a known population of weedy sea dragons that have been the subject of previous work by Hanny Sanchez-Camara in 2004, 5, 6, and also the paper in 2011. So during the course of this study, conducted 28 dives over almost 21 hours from April 2020 to April 2021. So the methods which we use to determine the habitat use and preferences and selection of sea dragons were a couple of different ones. So to determine habitat use, we sampled smaller microhabitats around where we found individual sea dragons, and then using the resource selection probability function to get information about habitat preferences, we compared the habitat use against the relative availability of habitat within the site. So we sampled relative availability using belt transects throughout the whole site to assess what habitat was actually there. Whilst we were running out these transects, both the small microhabitats and the longer availability transects, I assessed the availability of mysid shrimp, so just determining whether or not there were mysids present within that habitat in a swarm, and similarly throughout intervals along that larger transect. To get a comparison of habitat that sea dragons were not using, smaller microhabitat transects were also taken around where sea dragons were not found. This is just an example image of some of the typical habitat that we were finding for sea dragons. So you've got large clumps of Aclonia with a little bit of scattered rock, and then some bare sand as well. So this table just demonstrates the main benthic groups that we found during the course of the study at Cornell. So the main ones, as in that previous image I showed you, were Aclonia radiata, which was the most common habitat forming algae along the coast here in southeastern Australia. And then rock, which was constituted of bare rock, urchin barrens, and rocks covered in crustose coralline algae, and also just bare sand. These other habitats, such as caulerpa, rubble, sargassum, and sponges, were all recorded as present and in some transects, but they were not the dominant habitat in any of the transects that we sampled. During the study, I identified 43 individual sea dragons, which were sighted a total of 90 times. This was done using the i3S spot software, which Keith Martin Smith demonstrated is 98% accurate in determining in correctly identifying sea dragons. So this image down here is just a correctly matched individual over the space of 2 months on June 2020 here on the left, and then in August 2020 here on the right. So the results that we found with habitat preferences, so using the resource selection probability function, showed that sea dragons do display a significant preference for Aclonia. So if the confidence interval here is above this line representing a habitat preference, then there is a significant preference. So Aclonia, sea dragons significantly preferred this habitat, whereas bare rock habitat, they significantly avoided. Sand habitat, the other dominant benthos, they showed no significant preference for. So building on that, in terms of factors driving habitat selection, we showed that when comparing areas of sea dragon habitat use, these darker bars here, to areas where sea dragons were not using habitat, that they were actively selecting habitat that had less sand and more Aclonia, and also where mysid shrimp were present. So when we introduced the interaction terms into the analysis, we found that the interaction between sand coverage, Aclonia coverage, and mysid availability was significant, which suggests that all three of these are driving sea dragon habitat selection. So we suggest that there is an optimal combination of Aclonia coverage of roughly 32% and roughly 45% of sand coverage, as well as the presence of mysids, which is the most ideal habitat for sea dragons. So we suggest that with this data, we will be able to predict where we can find sea dragons based off habitat and other variables within a site. So in summary, the main findings that we have here were we showed that weedy sea dragons do display a significant preference for a clonia habitat, whilst showing that they significantly avoid habitat that's dominated by rock. Habitat selection in sea dragons is being driven by a combination of benthic substrate coverage of both sand and clonia, and also mysid availability. So as I said, we believe that we'll be able to use this to help to model and predict sea dragon habitat suitability and sea dragon occurrences towards their northern range limits. The strong association and high habitat specificity that we demonstrated in this study is typical of cygnathids, and this could render sea dragons particularly vulnerable to the impacts of habitat loss under climate change. This study here on the right by Castro et al. In 2020 showed that under RCP 8.5 there will be significant declines down towards Sydney here, significant declines in a clonia habitat, which may directly impact sea dragon populations, particularly those northern populations, which may be more vulnerable than ones further south. So currently we are assessing the vulnerability of these northern populations of weedy sea dragons on the east coast of Australia to the effects of habitat loss under climate change. So we're monitoring a number of different sites to gather data on the habitat which is present and other environmental variables. And then following that, we are aiming to investigate, building on the research of Clanton et al., which Selma has just presented on. Building on that research, we're aiming to investigate the habitat associations of sea dragons throughout these distinct populations, which have been shown throughout New South Wales and southern New South Wales down into the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. So showing if there is different habitat associations or different factors driving habitat selection, we will be able to contribute to developing effective management for these potentially distinct populations. As you can see in this photo here, sea dragons down in Victoria are anecdotally found over habitat that's typically dominated by seagrass and in shallow habitat, whereas these more northern populations, Port Stephens and Kurnell, are found over a clonia, which is demonstrated in the background of these photos here. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, feel free to unmute and ask your questions, anybody. While we're waiting, I was just wondering, I presented some of the diver log data from the last 60 years or so, and there was a distinct period in the 80s when they were rarely, if ever, seen. I'm just wondering if we could investigate whether there was a lack of kelp or there was some other factor that you've turned up in terms of habitat preference that might explain the much reduced numbers at that time in the long term.
Yeah, that could be interesting to look at. We'll just have to see if there's any mapping that would really give us a good idea of what sort of habitat was available at that time. But yeah, it could definitely be interesting to look at.
Yeah, at least in that region, seagrass mapping has, certainly Botany Bay, there was a large study in the 80s that the DPI fisheries were involved with, but they measured everything you can name about the environment, and those data are largely unpublished, but I know someone who has them, so maybe that's something to have to look at in the future. There's one from Nerida. Nerida Wilson. I might just relay that to you. I was interested in your statement that the dragons avoided rock. But at Kernel, aren't they all at the base of a rock wall? Thanks for your thoughts. So in other words, what's the rock association?
Yeah, thanks, Nerida. Good question. So they are sort of at the base of a big rock wall, but that's more so just the site. Where you actually find the dragons when you're diving at that site is, as was mentioned, is along the kelp sand interface. So I spent quite a bit of time through these dives also going through the areas that are dominated by rock, getting different samples to make sure I covered all the habitat. And there was very, very few, only 1 or 2 sea dragons that were found in that habitat that was completely dominated by rock. So they are definitely sort of congregating further out on that edge where you're getting that direct line of sand and kelp.
I've spotted one from Kenyon in the chat. He says, nice talk, but he also wondered if there's a male-female difference of any sort you've noticed in habitat preference.
I hadn't noticed any. I did perform some sort of a bit of analysis on that to determine if there was any sex-based differences, but I would say the only difference, that none of it came up significant, but the only difference there might be would be from pregnant males, because as we know, they do go a little bit shallower, but during the course of this study, we only identified about 5 pregnant males. So there wasn't really enough to get a valid statistical inference on whether or not they had a different habitat preference, but just from males and females, generally, there was no difference.
Okay. A question.
So is that a question?
Ingrid, are you asking a question? Go ahead. We've got just a couple of minutes, I noticed, and I think we've finished with sea dragons. So if anyone has any, feel free to unmute if you want to do a quick round table or anything like that. Or you have any other questions?
Hi Sam, I have a small question. Whether the kelp will die seasonally?
Sorry, what was that? Where does the kelp
will die at some month, some season? When the water, the temperature of the water is increasing, whether the kelp will die?
Yeah, so sorry, just to make sure I understand, asking when the kelp dies, at what temperature was that?
Yeah. So I just want to know when the kelp is died, whether the weedy dragon will move away from here.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure at what exact temperature mortality of the kelp begins to increase, but that's what we're hoping to assess with the next chapter of my research, is looking at how the populations that are right up at those northern range edges are going to be vulnerable, because as we know in your question before, sea dragons, they're not great swimmers, and as we know, they don't have any great migrational capacity. So what we think at this point is, if there were to be great kelp losses, those populations at the northern range edges, unless they are able to migrate somehow, which we don't think they would be able to, then they would be particularly vulnerable to increased kelp mortality.
Okay, thank you.